Well, first of all, I'd like to say just how pleased I am to be contributing to this inaugural edition of a fantastic new journal, which really attracts me for its global perspective, its comparative approach, and its going beyond the boundaries of discipline. So all of this makes it, for me, a perfect venue for my paper on the climate emergency. In terms of the climate emergency, for the natural scientist, it doesn't really matter whether one person is producing 100 tons of CO2 gas or 100 people. It's of no account. But for a social scientist, it is absolutely critical for us to look at it in terms of the per capita of who produces most greenhouse gases, where and how. So, for example, in the United States, the top decile of income earners produce twice as much greenhouse gases as even the top decile of income earners in the United Kingdom. And if we look at what's happened in the cost of living crisis just now, we can see that the bottom decile, even in a wealthy country like the United Kingdom, have had to cut back on their use of energy and food, with the consequence that they will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So from a social scientific point of view, and looking at climate change as a result of sociogenesis of climate change, we have to really look at how these wealth inequalities have arisen. And it's not just a question of market wealth inequalities. There are huge inequalities in environmental resources in different countries. So, for example, the United States is more or less self-sufficient in both fossil energy and high-quality agricultural land. And if there's one thing that the Ukraine war has shown us, and it is how it's exposed the fact that some countries have those kind of resources and other countries don't. And when one looks at a comparison, for example, between Germany and India, Germany, mostly its own domestic coal, burns 4 times more coal per capita than the average Indian. And the average Indian is in fact responsible for emitting greenhouse gases at a lower level than is required to meet the target of 1.5 degrees warming. So we have to look at both these dimensions and how they've arisen in terms of how countries have exploited historically, both through their own national territorial resources and colonization, how they've developed these wealth inequalities and consequently enormously unequal contributions to the climate emergency. And this finally really suggests that there is a major problem in terms of political process as currently being as currently organized through the United Nations. Now, I will have to stress that without the United Nations initiatives in this area, we would have been in a far, far worse situation than we are now. But one of the real problems with the United Nations is that it has really enshrined the principle of national sovereignty. And that includes the sovereign right to exploit its country's own environmental resources. But when one looks at fossil energy, for example, in order to meet the 1.5 degrees target, the vast majority of those fossil energy resources have to be locked underground. And that is a hugely different challenge between countries that are very wealthy and countries which are not so wealthy and in the process of developing. And this is, so we have to look at now the limits of the United Nations political process, where they look at national determined contributions. So it's each nation unto its own in dealing with climate change. And that is simply not going to address these key issues of how to lock fossil fuel and energy underground, or the wealth inequalities and the different inequalities in terms of greenhouse gas emergency. And this means essentially that we have to think of ways of affording greater supranational powers, whether to deal with pandemics or with climate change, to the United Nations. And the kind of analysis that is contained in this paper is really a social scientific contribution to a transformation of that political process.